Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of this special lecture for Paleocast. And I am Dr. Alejandro Izquierdo-Lopez, and in the previous lecture, I have reviewed a little bit on what was the Cambrian Explosion and what does it tell us about the first diversification of animals. So let's talk about how does the world look 500 million years ago. And this is just a small snippet of a specific time period during the Cambrian. Of course, the Cambrian expands for almost 40 million years. So these continents will at some point go a little bit northern and diversify a little bit on how they are in this picture. But this basically tells us you about the main land masses of that time period, which are, for example, Laurentia, which encompasses more of North America, although some parts will later appear and other parts were potentially part of other sections of other continents. We also have Baltica, so nowadays Northern Europe, Siberia, Australia, China divided into two, as well as the megacontinent of Gondwana, which encompasses not only what is now Africa, also part of Asia, South America, and so on. So this is how the world looks like, and the average temperature is calculated to be around 24 degrees. Of course, there are different estimates, but what is clear is that it was hotter than it is nowadays. So this means that there were no permanent ice caps in the poles. So during the winter, you will have probably ice caps, but otherwise during the summer, you will not have any ice caps. So this gives us a very, very warm world where the tropical regions will be, as you see, most of the continents are placed around them. So most of the fauna we will find here, you can consider to be tropical. So what happened, of course, is that because there was more water, many of the continents, the sea level was higher than nowadays. So many of the continents were partly underwater compared to what they will be nowadays. And this means that we have a very special ecosystem more prominent at that time than there is now. This ecosystem is called the shallow waters. So of course, nowadays we do have shallow waters. These are mostly areas where you find marine areas that are not very deep. They're maximum 100 meters deep. And you can find them, for example, in coral islands, for example, or other types of similar environments where you see that the distance between the surface of the water and the bottom is very shallow. Of course, at that time, those environments were more spread than nowadays. And this is also where we find the Burgess Shale. So you can imagine the Burgess Shale inside this type of shallow water environment. Of course, this is not the only environment that we know it existed on the Cambrian. We have evidence that some of the sites that we know, like Xinjiang, were probably deltaic, so they were deltas. Other parts were more coastal, other parts were a little bit farther from the coastline, and so on. Of course, we do have very small snippets, even if we compare all the different sites of exceptional preservation we have. Our complete understanding of the Cambrian period is still limited. So there are areas like deep sea, for example, or open sea areas that we may not know as much as other types of areas. But we know, of course, that the ecosystems of the Cambrian, we have very important complex marine ecosystems where you will find, for example, a lot of diversity of arthropods. So arthropods, the group that nowadays encompasses from ants to crustaceans, at that time was the dominant group in terms of diversity, of morphological diversity, and also playing important roles in their ecosystem. So that's top predators, for example, and so on. So these ecosystems were, of course, will change across the Paleozoic, but this is a small start where you find already complex bioturbation. You have the start of the different food chains across the water column, linking basically the top of the water column to the bottom of the water column. But of course, these interactions between all across the water column will become more complex afterwards. And the question, of course, is, was there life on land? We do not have fossils of plants. In fact, the fossils of plants come way much later. In fact, they come, I think, during the Silurian period. So what we have, though, is spores, and these spores have been related to some algae, like, for example, Charophytas, and Charophytas are probably the algae that are closest to land plants like mosses or hornworts. And there is the idea then that maybe some of the first plants, something in between a charophyta and a moss, for example, will have become land plants already. So they will have inhabited some of the areas probably close to the coastlines or probably close to like water systems like rivers. Of course, we don't have the fossil evidence. We only have these sports, but it's possible that there was already some type of life on land. And this also like thought because we also have some trackways, and these trackways, based on their the geological and mechanical studies, we can interpret them as being in a shallow water environment, but very close to like the coastline in areas where, for example, the water will recede and the trackways will preserve that way. So this means that some of these animals were already present in some type of brackish waters, or they were doing small excursions into land, but of course always being very tied to the water environment. These trackways are made by mollusks as well as by some arthropods called the eusicarcinoids. So we do think that maybe we have some small ecosystems on land, but we still don't have the full picture on that. And it's clear that later down the line, these interactions and these ecosystems will become way more complex. So now let's talk about the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale is, of course, the topic of this talk, and it's a fossil site that is present in British Columbia. So the Burgess Shale was at that time here in Laurentia, in the northern part of the continent, and it was, of course, a tropical site. Nowadays, it's located far northern in Canada, again in British Columbia, in the Rocky Mountains. So you can see it here. The Rocky Mountains go across the provinces of British Columbia and Alberta. And here you find the national parks of Kootenay and Yoho, where you can see the Burgess Shale. So what was the Burgess Shale? This is a photo of the Burgess Shale nowadays, and you can see, of course, that it's at top of the mountain ridge. So in order to find the Burgess Shale, you must like walk around like 5 or 6 hours uphill. This is how the Burgess Shale actually we think it looked like. So we think it was an environment that was around like basically we have a cliff, a marine cliff that nowadays is preserved in what's called the cathedral escarpment. So you can see there's some differences between the stones here, the cathedral escarpment, and the stones afterwards. So this is the difference between the cliff and the bottom of the cliffs where all the fossils will be deposited. So here will be there. And this cliff will be quite far from the coast. It will be around 400 kilometers, but it's still a shallow water environment. You can see it's only 100 meters in depth. So still very far from the coast, but also very shallow. Some of the parts of the cathedral escarpment here are nowadays mounts like Bauta Mountain, the Mount Field, Mount Stephen, and Mount Alderey. And here in yellow are some of the sites, but I will talk more about this. So this is an aerial photo of the Rocky Mountains and probably what is the Burgess Shale nowadays. So the Burgess Shale actually expands a long time. So it expands across, it's calculated around 40 kilometers as far as the latest explorations. But of course, it may be bigger or smaller. In order to understand where is the Burgess Shale, you have to find outcrops, so areas where the fossil rock is exposed and you can access it. And not all areas can be accessed because, of course, they are in the mountains, and also because some of them have not been exposed. They are inside the rock. So these are some of the different explorations that have happened during the years. And of course, you can see, for example, this is the original Walcott Quarry. You can walk there easily thanks to like a specific tour guide. And you have also different types of exploration. So, for example, here in the 80s, we have the Collins Quarries. And here we have the new area, the Tocum Creek and the Marble Canyon. And what is important about this is that we are basically amplifying our knowledge on the Burgess Shale in different scales. One of them is a temporal scale, because every of these sites is slightly younger or older. So we can have different fauna that varied across time. We also have differences in their environment. So, for example, we know that some of these areas were upper in the escarpment. So instead of being at the bottom of the cliff, were upper. So this means that the fauna that is at top of the cliff is different than the fauna that is at the bottom. And we also have areas that are a little bit closer or farther from this escarpment, from this cliff. So most of them, as you can see, are pretty close, but the Marble Canyon, for example, is slightly away. So you can also expect the fauna to be quite different. And this has allowed us to compare faunas and basically understand how each section of the Burgess Shale provides us different information of this time period, as this project by Dr. Carmen Anglu and Jean-Bernard Grant did some years ago, where they compared, for example, the fauna of the Marble Canyon to the Walcott Quarry, to the Raymond Quarry, and you can see that the composition of the species inhabiting those areas is different. So why is the Burgess Shale important? So this is basically the Burgess Shale if it was a very regular fossil site. So in fossil sites, not only the Cambrian, but across the fossil record, what it's easier to find is mineralized structures. So structures that have become hardened because they have acquired some minerals, these being calcite, other types. And of course, some of the mineralized animals of that time, you can have, for example, brachiopods, so shelled animals, as well as trilobites, which cuticle is also mineralized. So it's easy to find these animals. But the Burgess Shale offers more than that. The Burgess Shale also offers instances of soft preservation. So structures that otherwise in a normal, regular fossil record have not been preserved. And these structures, for example, include limbs, antennae, tails, as well as other animals that are, we can call them squishy animals or soft animals that do not have strong structures, mineralized structures that will be preserved normally. So we have both animals that otherwise we will not see, as well as features that otherwise we will not see. So the question is, why did this happen? Why is the Burgess Shale special? So we think that what happened was there was some type of mudflows. So we have here the cathedral escarpment, so this cliff, this submarine cliff. And across the submarine cliff, we will have like storms or earthquakes that will bring a lot of mud across the cliff. And this mud will suddenly bury all the animals in that section. So you will have like some storm, and this will create like some turbulence, and then you will have a giant mud flow, and this giant mud flow will entomb our animals. And by entombing these animals, what you can do is basically you halt decomposition. So you deplete the area from oxygen, and therefore there are no bacteria, no other scavenging animals that can eat you. And also, of course, you don't give access to your corpse to other animals that would otherwise feed on your remains, no? So these mudflows basically are covering the bodies and are also depleting the oxygen, so making preservation really useful. There are, of course, other features. We do think that the Cambrian was special in some sense. There was, I'm not going to go into detail because it's not my expertise, but there were some type of minerals that allowed for better preservation than they did not exist afterwards, or they were highly reduced compared to the Cambrian period. So this presence of these minerals probably was also helping to preserve these structures more often. And that's why we have a lot of sites of exceptional preservation in the Cambrian. So this is how the Burgess Shale would look like if it was a normal site, and this is how it actually looks like based on this very good reconstruction by Karel Bres van Kempen. So this is how the Burgess Shale looks like, and it's not the only site, as I mentioned before. We do have all other sites across the Cambrian period that preserve soft tissues, such as in China, like the Kaili Payota, the Xinjiang, or the Hongqing Shao. We have also the Sirius Passet in Greenland, the Paseki shale in Europe, and also different shales in Utah. There are different formations in Utah. So there's the Martian Formation and other ones. So all of these put together give us a really good understanding of the Cambrian period. So let's talk a little bit about the history of research at the Burgess Shale to understand how our thinking of these fossils has changed through time. So this is again our fossil site, and this was first explored by Charles D. Walcott. Of course, there have been other scientists as well as people that were just curious about what they called stone bugs at that time. And of course, some first researchers who found trilobites. But Charles D. Walcott was the first person that actually went there and created a full expedition and collected a lot of fossils. And of course, as Charles the Little Walcott noticed, many of these fossils are very difficult to locate and obtain them. So Charles D. Walcott, of course, brought many fossils. Most of them are currently at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, as well as some of them at the Royal Ontario Museum. And what he also did, which was great, was to create the first reviews on these fossils. For example, this is the 1912 book on arthropods, and you can see that some of these fossils are already spectacular. In fact, you can say that some of the fossils that Walcott found at that time have not been found again. So some of this preservation is magnificent. So you can see some of the typical animals like Marella or Canadaspis here. And of course, Charles D. Walcott basically focused on two things: discovering these animals, interpreting their morphology, and their classification. And the classification of Walcott was a very conservative classification. Basically, what he did was, this is a Paleozoic fauna, not very different from the Ordovician fauna, for example. So these animals must be part of faunas that we know nowadays. For example, crustaceans, so crabs and shrimps. So for example, many of these animals were classified as crabs or shrimps, and for example, Marella as a trilobite. In the next years, of course, we have different researchers. I just wanted to highlight, for example, Percy Raymond and Charles E. Resser, who also explored the Burgess Shale. So there is a Raymond quarry nowadays, and Resser explored all the other areas that are not now part of this exact formation. They are like a slightly younger formation. And of course, we have a lot of indirect researchers who took a look at the specimens or at the descriptions published by Walcott and created their own interpretations, mostly, for example, Simonetta and Del Caf in Italy, and as well as other people like Rolf or Stormer. So these people not only created their new reconstruction on these animals, sometimes they described new fossils that they thought that they should be described, and also reclassified some of these animals. So there was some movement on the classification on the Burgess Shale fauna. And of course, we have also slightly, all the time, we have an increased improvement on the reconstruction as more fossils are examined, and these researchers spend more time on them. Walcott did an amazing work, but it was only one person. And as more people take a look on these fossils, you improve these reconstructions. So again, these people focused a lot on discovery as well as taxonomy, and first of all, like slightly like the phylogeny of these arthropods. So there were already some ideas on how these arthropods will place in relation to current groups, not only arthropods but other groups as well. And then we have a very important time period. As you can see, there has been a lot of time elapsing until the 1970s and 1980s. So for a long time, the Burgess Shale had been, researched by these people, but it didn't have the fame that it has nowadays. And these people were responsible for that. So Harry Whittington, as well as Derek Briggs and Simon Conway Morris, at that time were studying fossils of the Burgess Shale, and this led to a lot of different reconstruction of these animals, different interpretations on how they would be placed in these other groups, and led to these basically books, one of them by Simon Conway Morris himself, The Crucible of Creation, and Wonderful Life, which I already mentioned before. So it is in this time that we have the reconstruction of the most iconic animals of the Burgess Shale. So for the first time, there is a good reconstruction of Hallucigenia, and Oncalucaris is brought up together, as I will explain later in the arthropod section, Wiwaxia, Marella, and so on. So how has our understanding of the Burgess Shale fossils changed? During the early 20th century, we think that these were some type of Paleozoic animals classifiable in current groups, like again, crustaceans or mollusks. We also had an improvement, of course, as more people look at these fossils, more fossils were discovered. There was an improvement on the diversity, the reconstruction, and of course, the imaging methods, making better and better reconstructions. And then, of course, during the 80s, there were two schools of thought. One of them was Gould's school of thought, if you read A Wonderful Life, which is that many of these animals were unique. They were remnants of a fauna that afterwards went completely extinct. So many of these animals, according to Gould, were extremely strange, were body plans that later down the line would never appear again. But of course, there was another school of thought, Conway Morris, which thought that we should have a more conservative approach, and these animals are part of current groups. So what happened, of course, is we ended up going more with Conway Morris school of thought, and that was also thanks to the origin of the concept of the STEM group. And this STEM group means that if we have a group like crustaceans here, the sister group to that one could be called the STEM group. Of course, it's more complicated than this, but just the main take is this one. So we think that many of these animals are neither, they are neither present in classifiable in these groups, like it's said in the 1910s. They are also not very strange animal that will be completely unrelated. They are related, but they are very ancestral comparatively. We could call them that. And of course, what has happened since is we have a lot of new excavation sites from from Collins as well as Jean-Bernard Caron, and of course a lot of international publications in the last years. So mostly thanks to Jean-Bernard Caron and colleagues, we have expanded our thought on these animals. But of course, there are still many more mysteries and much learned to discover. So with that, I finish this section and I encourage you to watch the next section. So thank you very much.